Well, that's the international economic system in a very quick nutshell. What about the international political system based on the UN Charter? That one we can go through we can be brief. The fundamental principle of the United Nations Charter is a flat prohibition against the threat or use of force in international affairs. Sole exception is either self-defense if somebody attacks you until the Security Council acts, or else when authorized by the Security Council. Well, we've just been through a dramatic illustration of the status of this principle, namely the Iraq crisis. There was a good deal of discussion of what measures the United States should take. Should it do this? Should it do that? Should it do the other thing? But I couldn't find any discussion at all of the idea that maybe we should live up to what is technically the supreme law of the land under the Constitution, namely the United Nations Charter, which bars the United States from doing anything except on the specific authorization of the Security Council. That wasn't even an option, so that's not considered. In fact, if you read Secretary of State Albright's statements and others, President Clinton and the rest, they simply said, we will act as we determine appropriate in judgment of our so-called national interest. If we decide that we will use force or threaten force, nobody's going to change that because we regard ourselves as a rogue state which is free from any international obligations and certainly any conditions imposed by the UN Charter. Well, that's dead. The Charter's words. Thanks to the actions of the most powerful states, and there's nothing new about this. More than 10 years ago, back in 1986, the United States even went so far as to veto a Security Council resolution which called on all states to observe international law, mentioning no one in particular, but everyone knew who they meant. It was an oblique reference to the fact that the World Court had just determined that the United States was guilty of what the court called unlawful use of force, a polite way of referring to aggression in its terrorist war against Nicaragua. And of course, the U.S. rejected the judgment of the court with complete contempt, as did intellectual opinion. But then it went to the Security Council, where the U.S. vetoed a resolution calling on states to observe international law, and it then proceeded to veto several General Assembly resolutions with the same. You can't technically veto the General Assembly resolution, but when the U.S. votes against it, if the vote is, let's say, 150 to 1, as it often is, the resolution is essentially vetoed. So this is old. The international political system is basically weapons that you can use against the weak. Well, let's turn to the third pillar of the New World Order, the Universal Declaration. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is based on the principle, the fundamental principle of it is given in the phrase universal. The provisions of the Universal Declaration are to have equal standing. That is, there are no grounds for what is called relativism, self-serving relativism, a decision to selectively adopt one or another of the provisions. And there certainly are no grounds for the particularly ugly form of selective relativism, which involves appeal to the Universal Declaration as a weapon against enemies. There was a vast amount of discussion about this just about 5 years ago. There was a conference at Vienna in 1993 on the Universal Declaration. You look back at the press, many of you will remember there was a deluge of impressive rhetoric which was praising Washington's courage in standing up against, in upholding the universality of the Universal Declaration against what were called third world relativists, people who appeal to Asian values or other deviations from the sacred principles. Well, those are good principles, maybe even noble principles, and we can ask how well they have fared over the years, concentrating on the most important case, the most powerful state, the self-appointed guardian of global virtue, and defender of the universality of the Universal Declaration. And apart from those objective factors, the state that's, of course, most important for us, for the obvious reason that we share responsibility for what it does, either by lending support or by tacit acquiescence. Well, you look at the Universal Declaration, you find that its provisions fall into two major categories. The first is what are called civil and political rights. The second, what are called socioeconomic rights. Let's start with the civil and political rights. The UD, the Universal Declaration, is not very well known in the United States. So you can ask your friends to list the resolutions, and you probably won't get very good answers. But there is one article which is very well known, the most famous of all. That's Article 13. It says, "Everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own." The reason why that is very well known is that every year on Human Rights Day, December 10th, there were huge demonstrations and big advertisements and so on denouncing the Soviet Union correctly for rejecting Article 13 and not allowing Soviet Jews to leave. So that's Article 13. Actually, that's part of Article 13. Actually, what Article 13 says is something a little different, and I have never seen the final words quoted in all of this, in all of this massive publicity. What Article 13 says is everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and return to his own country. Well, those final words are omitted. Their meaning was spelled out on December 11th, 1948, the day after the acceptance of the Universal Declaration, in UN Resolution 194, which was unanimously accepted as well, and which stated that Palestinian refugees who had fled or been expelled from their homes had the right of return, or if they chose not to return, of compensation. The compensation would have been no small matter. The government of Israel secretly, it's now released in secret documents, estimated the compensation costs at that time at about $1 billion, which would be roughly $6 billion today, not counting interest, far greater than German reparations. Well, that's Resolution 194, that's Article 13. Half of it states that anyone, and specifically Palestinians, they were the ones they were talking about, have the right to return to their own country. Well, that's the history of this is kind of interesting. If you think it through, you'll notice that the most passionate and vocal defenders of Article 13 were, and the ones who were most angrily denouncing the Soviet Union for rejecting it, are in fact the strongest opponents of Article 13. They would never have considered for a moment permitting Article 13 to apply. Article 13, the Resolution 194 calling for the right of Palestinians to return, that was voted, as I mentioned, unanimously, and again every year. Year after year it was endorsed, completely hypocritically, of course. No one really meant it. But notice that this is a case of really extreme relativism. We take an article of the Universal Declaration and decide that the last 5 words of it don't exist, the ones that apply in a fashion which the powerful, in this case the United States and its clients, do not accept. That's relativism pushed to an extreme, apart from the hypocrisy. To the credit of the Clinton administration, they did end the hypocrisy. In 1993, for the first time, the United States voted against Resolution 194, along with Israel. That rescinds the second half of Article 13. The first half is now irrelevant with the Soviet Union gone, so there's no more hypocrisy. Article 13 is simply removed from the Universal Declaration by U.S. fiat. As for the refugees, the millions of refugees, they have been disappeared, to borrow a term of our Latin American clients. The so-called peace process doesn't even mention them, offers them nothing. Well, that's Article 13. It's relativism triumphant.